What if the Four Horsemen, long discussed by biblical scholars, are already being positioned now to begin their final ride? And if so, what would that look like for our world? What ideological forces might be in conflict if the nations attempt to assemble during this time? And what level of involvement does God truly assume in human governance? The prophet Daniel said that in the last days, knowledge would increase, and I believe today's guest is here to share some of that knowledge right now. Hello and welcome back to Skywatch TV. I'm Joe Artis Horn. Today we continue with our special guest, and we're going to be talking about his explosive brand new book. Let me introduce who's here. He's a respected Bible teacher and public speaker with over 45 years of experience who's inspired audiences across 7 countries and 3 continents. He's the founder and former pastor of River of Life Ministries Church. Please welcome Curtis Liebl. If you missed last week's program, go back to the archives wherever you watch Skywatch television. Maybe it's the Skywatch TV mobile app that you can download free right now from the App Store. You would have caught the fact that we started a dialogue on the Four Horsemen, frameworked in concept that I myself had never heard before, and I think you blew the minds, Curtis, of a lot of our guests here today. And I will try to generalize for those that missed the show in that the Four Horsemen that people immediately think of the apocalypse aren't these entities that are sitting in the spiritual holding cells waiting for their big day at the end of time to suddenly activate and be involved in the unfolding of Bible prophecy. But you assert they've been here since the dawn of time and have been used throughout parts of history for the construction, deconstruction of cities, spiritual movements, and are alive today, involved in much of what is shaping people's thoughts, their opinions, their activities, what might be happening theopolitically. Let me read the title of his book. We'll put this up on the screen for you. The Four Horsemen, The Winds of Theopolitical Change, Unraveling the Mystery of the Ancient Spirit of Babylon and the Intoxication of the Nations. What a great title and subtitle, Curtis. I want to hit the ground running because we always have so much that we're trying to jam into these short episodes. The last chapter of your book is titled The Final Ride of the Four Horsemen, The Assembling of the Nations. Explain that title for us, and you're also going to weave in the 4 winds.
Yes. It starts with the idea of something that we introduced a little earlier, and that is in Zephaniah 3:8, it was God that said it's his decision to gather nations and to assemble kingdoms. And so he decides when, he decides how, and he has the forces to do it. In ride the Four Horsemen. Okay, and so this idea of assembling starts with unassembling the individual nations. You can't expect nations to come together without taking away individual sovereignty. And so we look at a framework in the last 100 years, and we see that there was this great dismantling of sovereignty in the world. For example, the Chinese Empire in the turn of the 20th century, 2,000 years of dynasties crumbled, and a new ideology took place. We have the fall of the Ottoman Empire in World War I, which is 400 years of dominance over Israel. We have this idea that the Russian czars over 200 years were in power, and then they fell in the Bolshevik Revolution. And so when you see all these things happening, you're seeing that power is being taken away. And then something begins to build. And World War I was a catalyst in which we saw formed out of that the League of Nations, which became the United Nations, which is this assembling of global powers, global commerce, global technology. All of this is being assembled. And is there a supernatural force behind that? That's the question. And I believe the mission of the White Horseman, he's sent out conquering to conquer. First of all, the color white means finality. We have the white throne judgment. We have white robes. This idea of white is always like a finality. So this is the final march of the nations, if you will. And so conquering to conquer is a double play on words, which means it's going to happen. It's going to be sure. Conquering and to conquer. So it's not a matter of if, again, it's a matter of when. And the 2 missions that I believe that the White Horseman has is 1, to assemble the nations and build the last beast system, and number 2, open a pathway for the repatriation of Israel.
I love the way you put last week that this is a chessboard.
Yes.
And if anybody's ever played chess, you play a game and then you clear the board. The Lord, and I believe in World War I, in many ways cleared the board. And he is reassembling those pieces. He put them back on the board, but not the way they were. In fact, he's still redrawing dotted lines around the globe. When you look at a map, it's changing every day. In fact, President Trump wants to redraw the lines. He said it in the Middle East. That's big.
It's very big. We see this idea that, for example, when the Ottoman Empire fell, it opened a pathway for the whole Levant to be opened up. That had to be supernatural.
Yes.
Because God had a plan. The next thing we see about the Four Horsemen is, like a lot of us in our minds have this idea that in a 7-year period, we're going to see the Four Horsemen just usher in this global beast system, and it's going to be tyrannical and it's going to be intense. But it takes more than a few years to bring the whole globe into unity. And I believe that march is not a 7-year march, but it's a 100-year march. And that 100-year march is incremental. We had World War II. We have the development in 1948 of Israel becoming a nation, and then 1967, Jerusalem being liberated. So this is a progression. And when I followed the progression, and I do that in my book, and I point out these different dates and different times, we see that twofold mission of the white horse is being accomplished incrementally. And I believe, as we all kind of sense, there's going to be a final rush or ride at the end. So a final, like, very identifiable Four Horsemen impact. But I believe they have been riding.
You know, Curtis, this is a masterpiece, and it's something I told everybody last week. It's not an opportunity that you're going to want to miss out on. We're going to show you in just a few minutes how you can get a copy of your very own copy of the book. But in the chapter, The Final Ride of the Four Horsemen, what strong ideological forces are in conflict during this time?
So the idea of war, you know, we attach war to all of this. A rise and fall of nations has to be done through force, right? What is the force behind the force? And I believe this is ideologies. You know, there's several ideologies throughout history that we can see very clearly. For example, polytheism and monotheism. There's huge fights over that. You know, the Babylonian Empire was polytheistic. The Persians and the Medes had a base in Zoroastrianism, which was monotheistic, hence making them more sympathetic to another monotheistic group, the Jews, and let them go back home. Okay, so that ideology had to be introduced. It's my belief that the red horseman is the ideological horse. Anytime there is war, this horse comes in to stir the ideological issues. Communism versus capitalism, we saw that very, very big issues. We see the issue of Islam and Christianity, for example, and how that played out in when Islam was created in the middle centuries. But there has to be some strong conviction, ideology that forces people to come to the battlefield. And who stirs that?
Right.
You know, I believe the great sword that's given to the red horseman is not a sword of steel, but it's the sword of the pen or the words.
Yeah.
So what's stronger, the sword or the pen?
The pen.
Right.
Is it steel or is it words? Convictions, thoughts, ideologies.
Absolutely.
And so that is necessary for the white horseman to do his conquering. And it says it's given to the red horseman to take peace from the earth. Well, look at any ideological conflict, and it takes peace from the earth. Communism versus capitalism, you know, huge in our last 100 years.
Well, it's gotten so easy for that horseman to spread his ideology changes because of the internet. Social media is a battlefield.
Yes.
Yes.
It's not social at all.
You know, I'd throw in there what we're facing today is radical feminism. Now, I'm all about my wife or any other woman having the right to vote and having the right to be in society and recognized for it. But we're talking about radical feminism. We're talking about this idea that comes from a harlot system in which that influence seeks to not just be equal, but to dominate.
Yes.
And when we have radical feminism that wants to dominate, that's an ism. And I call the Red Horsemen's ideology a fight of isms.
Yep.
Because we have feminism, communism, socialism, we have Darwinism. We've got all these isms that grab people, move them, cause them to be in conflict.
Yes.
And this is what precipitates any kind of battle or war.
Absolutely.
You know, one of the most fascinating parts of the book, Curtis, is when you talk about the fifth seal martyrs. the souls under the altar. And you see this as a key timeline passage. Do you want to get into that?
So if we can place the fifth seal at a certain time in history, that means two things. The four seals before that were already opened, and it also means that we're getting closer to the events of the sixth seal, which I believe we haven't seen yet. What is this fifth seal? So martyrs have always, in the things that I've heard and people that I've heard speak, be attributed to Christian martyrs. And of course, we honor our Christian martyrs, those who have given their life. Actually, my mother was killed by Muslims in Africa. She joined the ranks of the martyrs. But I believe that there's a specific language there in Revelation that tells us it's not Christian martyrs. Number one, they have a testimony, but not of Yeshua. They keep the word, and that testimony is attached to the word of God, which gives us an idea that this is very likely Jewish believers. Another thing I better add, that this group of martyrs cries out for vengeance. When will you avenge our blood? No Christian has been ever given that idea that they want to cry for vengeance.
Right.
But in Deuteronomy 32, I will avenge my people.
Right.
And so now we have this identifier in the martyrs that is most likely Jewish martyrs. And he says, wait a little while till your brethren go through the same thing. So when was the great, huge event in which Jewish people were martyred? And of course, we can attach that to the Holocaust and World War II. And if this is true, Joe, that means that we have a timeline, that some things happened before that timeline and some things are going to happen after that timeline. But that is kind of why I call it a marker, a time marker.
You know, Curtis, we often say on Skywatch TV, all one has to do is just discern what's happening right outside their own window to see that we're living in biblical prophetic times. We see so many systems now. And I'm not calling Bitcoin the system of the Antichrist, but I'm saying if it isn't, we're moving towards digital everything, digital authentication of my intellectual properties, the need to be digitally authenticated so that my assets, my home, the deed to everything that I own, my business, everything needs to be protected now from AI and this constant move towards, you know, the doing away with paper money. And nobody disputes that now. Nobody knows how to stop it because most of the people around the world view it as a form of arms race. Like the Chinese are not going to stop AI. They are going to march directly into digital currency if it's not already mandatory now. This idea of a citizen's standing, some kind of a social currency where you have played by the rules, so you are deemed not a terrorist. You can see if you want to keep access to your own funds and the ability to buy groceries, you can see this building, right? This system building out.
Right.
In your book, when you talk about the oppressor analysis, what is that specifically?
In the oppressor idea, this is actually an ancient pattern. It's not new. It's not new to Revelation. And it ties in with something we talked about earlier, which is the four horns and the four craftsmen. The four horns represent oppressors. And oppressors are sent for a reason. They're not just showing up and Yahweh God says, oops, I didn't know that was happening. No, they're there because of A, judgment, or B, because something has to be shifted or moved. So oppressors are allowed. There's 6 points to the oppressor analysis that I give. And the first one is this idea that the oppressor is introduced from one of the empires of the day. One that I'd give you an example of is during the Exodus. Pharaoh was an oppressor of the people. He was allowed to oppress, but he was only allowed to go so far. The second thing is that they have a God complex. It's the same thing that Paul says about the Antichrist. He's an oppressor. You talked about money being controlled. That's oppression.
Yes.
Let's talk about what it is.
Right.
And that oppression is an oppression for the masses. So this, along with the Pharaoh and this man of sin, he sits in the temple of God believing he is God, or acting as if he's God. And this is the God complex. Pharaoh's had this demigod status. Okay, and you can say the same thing about the Greeks. You can say the same thing about every empire, Babylon. They all believed that they were part of this demigod connection, this underworld connection to the Watchers, that they had a privileged status above all people. And this is where we get this God complex. The next time we see an oppressor show up in history is when Nebuchadnezzar himself comes in, and he's the oppressor. So the next thing the oppressor does is he oppresses the land and he oppresses the people of God. And he defiles the temple. This is a very important part, the abomination of desolation. So is that a one event or is that a layered event? We're going to talk about that. So Nebuchadnezzar does all these things, and he creates an image, and he has the three, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, bow down to this golden image. Well, I believe it was a golden image of himself because he was told he was the head of gold, right? So he's got this God complex, just like the oppressors have. I know I'm being brief. You'll have to get the book to get all the details. But the next oppressor I'm going to throw in there is actually Titus of the Roman army, who came in, defiled the temple, destroyed the people. He later was built to him a shrine in Rome to deify him and his father and his brother. He fits the oppressor analysis. And so this last pattern of oppression comes when the Antichrist comes. And he's going to fulfill every one of these oppressive roles.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, you can support the ministry of Skywatch TV and our continued efforts to share the gospel of Jesus Christ throughout the four corners of the world and receive your very own copy of this urgent new work when you order the Curtis Liebl Four Horsemen special offer. Not only does this incredible opportunity include Curtis Liebl's new book, The Four Horsemen, The Winds of Geopolitical Change, which unravels the mystery of the ancient spirit of Babylon and the intoxication of the nations, but it also includes the best-selling book, The Great Inception by Derek P. Gilbert. This incredible masterpiece reveals the hidden cosmic war between God and rebel gods, uncovers the truth about the Tower of Babel, the Red Sea crossing, and the Nephilim. Derek Gilbert takes you on an epic journey through history, the titans of Greek mythology, and biblical mystery that showcases the eye-opening battle for the throne of God. But that's not all. This special offer also includes the best-selling book, New World Order, Worlds in Collision and the Rebirth of Liberty by the legendary Terry James and Pete Garcia. This incredible work reveals the collapse of Western civilization, rampant corruption, crime, and chaos driven by a globalist agenda. This book warns of God's impending great reset to bring an end to the current ungodly age and usher in a magnificent transformation. Sold separately, these items hold a retail value of over $60. Yours now for your donation of only $45, which includes free shipping to all U.S. orders. So don't delay. You can scan the QR code on your screen using the camera app on your phone for instant access to this special opportunity, or you can visit us at skywatchtvstore.com or call 1-844-750-4985 and ask for the Curtis Liebl Four Horsemen special offer now. Don't miss your opportunity to get this important masterpiece.
Thank you, Joe. I wanted to circle back to something that we talked about earlier. I think it's a key that people need to unlock a certain mystery. We talk about this in Zechariah chapter 6, verse 5. The question is asked about the four horsemen, what are these? Isn't that the question we're trying to answer here? What are these? And he says very clearly, these are the four spirits of heaven, going forth after standing before the Lord of all the earth. Now, four spirits of heaven, that causes you to begin to look for other places where the four spirits of heaven are mentioned, right?
Right.
But you don't have all the pieces to that key because the word spirit there is ruach in Hebrew. And ruach also means wind. So is there a place in the Bible where it talks about the four winds of heaven? And that's where we land on this key. And it's in Daniel chapter 7, verse 2. It says, Daniel said, I was looking in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were sitting upon the great sea, and four great beasts were coming up from the sea, different from one another. So this informs us that the four winds of heaven are the four horsemen, and that they're the ones responsible for the kingdoms coming out of the sea. So that connecting point tells us that they are directly involved with the rise and fall of nations.
You know, something else in your book, Curtis, that we absolutely have to make sure we take time to touch on today. And again, ladies and gentlemen, we can't squeeze it all, not even close. We can't squeeze it all into these short episodes of Skywatch TV. But you have a really interesting perspective on prophetic cycles. And it's
Yes.
something you outline in the book. You want to just give us a taste?
Yeah. Prophetic cycles, again, as I kind of introduced in the book in the preface, prophetic cycles are necessary for understanding the patterns that God gives us. Prophetic cycles start with an idea, and I like to use the explanation of a transparency. We're all familiar with that little machine that's got the glass tabletop and it projects light onto the wall, and we put these transparencies on. And the very first transparency that usually makes it, when I was in high school, they called it the master. And then the master kind of sets the whole tone for what's being displayed. But then the teacher would then add these different transparencies on top, and they would be correlating with the master. But each transparency in and of itself was different. And this is the way I see Bible prophecy. Bible prophecy is we're given a master at some point in Scripture. And then what God does is he overlays another layer and another layer. It's a different layer in time. It's a different event.
Right.
But somehow, either through names of people, names of cities, events, they
Right.
all interconnect. And so I use that to explain it. And one that stands out very clear is during this time that we've been talking about when the Jews were coming back from Babylon and Zerubbabel was leading them, and with him was the high priest Joshua. Joshua was told in Zechariah 3:8, he said, "Indeed, you are men who are a symbol. Behold, I am going to bring my servant, the branch, for behold the stone that I set before Joshua, one stone are 7 eyes," etc., etc. The first clue that we get here is Joshua. I've heard you talk about this on the show before, that J's are only about 400 years old in the English language and literature. And before that, in the Bible, they were represented by Y's. So instead of Jacob, we'd have Yaakov. Or instead of Jerusalem, we'd have Yerushalem. All right? Same with Joshua. Instead of Joshua, it's Yeshua. Now, when you look at Yeshua in Hebrew, it means salvation. And that is actually Jesus' name in the Old Testament, Yeshua. So is it a mystery that Joshua here has the same name as Jesus? And Jesus is a symbol? So the first event, the first layer is this Joshua who's responsible for building the temple. Does that sound like a familiar theme?
Yeah.
And it says he's a symbol, but the one that was to come, the next layer, is called my servant, the branch, and the stone. Well, we know those are all accolades given to Jesus. And so now we see another Jesus that's going to build the temple, and this gives us a prophetic picture. And when we follow these layers, and I won't go too far deeper into that, we follow these layers, we can understand the current things that are going on.
You know, one of the things that I mentioned at the onset of the program that we have to get in is the Zerubbabel report.
Yeah.
Now, that's a new one for a lot of people, and I don't want to steal your thunder, but you were sharing some of this last night with me at dinner, and I said, you've got to make sure you get this over on the show. You got to explain this.
So again, one of these prophetic layers. Good thing we started with prophetic layers, right? Zerubbabel is a descendant of David. Now, we know that another descendant of David's going to rule, and it's going to be important, okay? But Zerubbabel was this figure in time, specifically 536 BC. And he's given a prophecy about him in Haggai that had nothing to do with that time. And I'll read it to you. It says, "Speak to Zerubbabel, governor of Judah, saying, I am going to shake the heavens and the earth. I will overthrow thrones and kingdoms and destroy the power of the kingdoms of the nations. It says, on that day, declares the Lord of hosts, I will take you, Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, my servant, declares the Lord, and I will make you a signet ring, for I have chosen you, declares the Lord of hosts." Now, what is this? This is something, now we know that the shaking is something we're seeing happen right now. This is thousands of years later. So this is, again, another prophetic layer. It's informing us of our time. When Yahweh's going to shake the nations, he's going to shake the kingdoms, and somehow a Zerubbabel figure is going to be in.
Wow.
Now, I named the ministry that I use to inform people about these kind of things the Zerubbabel Report.
Okay.
Because he's reporting on the shaking of the nations.
You're talking about the shaking of the nations, and that brings me to my next question. You know, a lot of people wonder, what level of involvement does God actually have when it comes to matters of human governance? And I know that's something you deal with in the book.
Yeah.
Do you think that the Four Horsemen are involved in that?
I do. I think that the Four Horsemen are the tools he uses to accomplish what he's going to accomplish, right? So back to this idea that Yahweh is the spiritual head, if you will, in the divine council. We have the arm, which is, we know Yeshua, Jesus is mentioned as the right arm, but then we have the fingers and the hands. This is the Four Horsemen. Matter of fact, you have 5 fingers. 4 of them could be the Four Horsemen. Just saying. But this idea of governance, I'll explain that with just a couple of passages. For example, God revealed to Daniel, whom he showed these metal empires through Nebuchadnezzar's dream, this picture, and his response to that was, it is he who changes the times and the epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings. So is he involved? Now, it's not just the kings of Judah, not just the kings of northern Israel. This passage and this dream means every king of every nation, and God's involved. Nebuchadnezzar, this king that we talked about several times, he has this epiphany at the end when he's goes 7 years, almost lost his mind, comes back to this realization. He says, but at the end of that period, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are counted as nothing, and he does according to his will in the hosts of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. You know, what more could we say? This is a Gentile king who's not a prophet, who did not write portions of the scripture, and he recognizes that Yahweh sits on the throne and determines all of these things.
Wow.
You know, Curtis, during the break earlier, one of the things that my mother, who's here today, reminded me of is my father, Dr. Thomas Horn. He used to say often that people are missing a lot about the Four Horsemen, that there's no work for what I'm suspicious could be missing. And it was one of the things he wanted to endeavor into. And I know that if he were alive today, he'd be sitting here trying to talk you into letting him publish your next book. Maybe we'll talk later about something like that.
Sounds good.
But he agreed that there was so much, it was kind of an uncharted, undiscovered, people have categorized it as a talk that, you know, everybody has kind of sorted out and there's writing on everything you need to know. I assert that this book, without it, you don't understand the Four Horsemen.
Amen.
You don't understand their roll down through time. You don't understand Bible prophecy today.
Right.
I know we've only got a minute and a half left, Curtis, but I want to make sure we get this in before we run out of time. Talk briefly about, and then give final thoughts before we wrap this program up, Yasha the Deliverers.
Yes. Yasha is a really interesting word in Hebrew. It connects to, first of all, the idea of the craftsmen, what they would craft to stop the horns from pushing. They were forces at work. One great example is in the Old Testament, we see judges that were raised up. Whenever Israel would be oppressed by an oppressor, there would be a judge raised up. Now, the Hebrew word for judge is shaphat, but it also is described as a yasha, which means a deliverer. Gideon was a great deliverer from the Midianites. It says they were anointed by the Spirit. And so this makes them anointed ones. Now, anointed ones are the same word that's used for Messiah, for Yeshua. Now, you might call them little messiahs. They weren't the Messiah, but they were anointed ones, and they were deliverers. The next connecting point is the simple fact that Yasha is the root word of Yeshua, which is Jesus. He's the great deliverer. So we see the pattern of deliverers, and then we come to the great deliverer. So he's setting us up. He's saying, you're going to understand who Jesus is because I'm going to show you over and over and over again what I'm going to do.
Everybody needs this book.
We're going to have to stop this discussion. We were never going to have time for all of it. Ladies and gentlemen, get your copy of The Four Horsemen, The Winds of Theopolitical Change right away. Don't delay. For everybody here in studio, everybody up here on panel, Curtis, thank you so much. We'll have to have you back sometime.
Yes.
We'll talk about another book. I'm Joe Artis Horn. Keep your eyes on the prize, which is Jesus Christ. We'll be back.